Hello folks, today I want to do a little book review and I want to talk to you about a book called We Hold These Truths, a Reverent Review of the U.S. Constitution by Lawrence Patton McDonald. If you've ever looked for a book explaining to you in detail the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, the intent that the founding fathers had with the Constitution, and how later on in the ensuing 200 some years, though the founders' intentions were violated and there's so many abuses were done against the Constitution to where now you have this mega big government apparatus there. And you might have asked yourself the question, is that really what the founders intended, where you have this huge mighty federal government and the states governments, the role of the states just kind of becoming more and more, becoming less and less and less. Is that really what the founders intended? Is that what they wanted? So I recommend you get this book here. Now this is not a new book. You can order fresh from Amazon.com or anywhere. You have to get yourself a used copy because this book was originally released in 1976. I have in my hand a 1993 edition because the author's wife, Catherine J. McDonald, faithfully continued the work of publishing the work, and she even edited in some areas, bringing in some facts, of the constitutional abuses of Reagan, Bush, and Clinton eras, adding in some facts here and there, adding some of the mistakes they made in violating sound constitutional principles. Dr. Larry McDonald was an excellent conservative, a consistent conservative. Someone that voted no on really every bill, expanding government, raising taxes, a firm believer in less government. Probably one of the most consistent, principled conservatives in the 20th century. A brilliant Christian, brilliant conservative, and a brilliant constitutionalist. Excellent. This is a man who went to Washington not to join the system, but one to really uphold the Constitution, and I mean the literal Constitution, not what people today say, where the Constitution just becomes a living document and you can make it say whatever you want to, whatever any sociological group wants it to say, whatever the current philosophy that's hip is, none of that. He really believed in the founder, in the intent, in the original intent of the founders. This is a reverent review. This is not a modern review, and it's not a review by some America-hating, godless, atheistic, and secular humanist group. This is a reverent review of the United States Constitution. Now, a word about the author. He was born in 1935 in Atlanta, Georgia, became a medical doctor, joined the U.S. Navy, was a flight surgeon there, and then in 1983 he boarded a plane toward Seoul, South Korea, some kind of event dealing with the anniversary of the end of the Korean War. That's where he wanted to go to. But the plane, flight KAL, Korean Airlines 007, a Boeing 747, veered off its course, entered Soviet airspace, and the Soviets shot down a civilian airplane by a Korean airline. And aboard was Dr. Larry McDonald. He was the only U.S. congressman to die as a result of Cold War aggression. And, it is likely that Dr. McDonald died in that act of Soviet aggression. But I want you to know that there are, I would say, theories. Now, there's evidence that the plane could have made it safely to the ground, making a water ditching, because what's really not documented is the last 10 minutes of what happened after the Soviets shot the plane. They fired off 2 missiles, one missed, one hit, I believe, and then the pilots were able to stabilize the plane again, and then all of a sudden all the flight data recorders quit recording. But radar evidence says that the plane was in the air for another, I think, 10 to 15 minutes, anywhere in that time frame, and it slowly spiraled down to the ground, or down to the ocean off Moneron Island. That's near the Sakhalin Peninsula, I think it's peninsula. Moneron Island, look it up on Google Maps or Google Earth. It'll show you a little island. It pretty much looks like it's almost uninhabited. And the Soviets, of course, once the airplane was down, were very quick to pull everything out of the ocean, everything out that was anywhere, any leftover of this plane. And if there were survivors, because of this water ditching, there could be, technically there could be a chance for survivors. I'm not saying that it is, that it was that way, but there are theories out there, and I think very credible theory, very credible evidence that there could be survivors, or that at least the Soviets, or now the Russians, are hiding some evidence, some leftovers of the plane that could give us a more factual idea of what really happened on September 1st, 1983. Dr. Larry McDonald was pretty much a conservative, voted no on bills expanding government or raising taxes, believed in less government, firm believer in less government. Now, if you ever drive down to Georgia toward Atlanta, you will be on Interstate 75, and a portion of Interstate 75 in North Georgia, when you drive when you come down from Tennessee into Georgia, that portion of Interstate 75 was named the Larry McDonald Memorial Highway. And when I drive down Interstate 75, I really try to remember this great conservative leader. I really think about him when I'm driving down there, and it's a worthy memorial for a great man. A little bit more about Dr. McDonald and his work. This book here was published by the Larry McDonald Memorial Foundation. Dr. McDonald also is the man behind the Western Goals Foundation, but I really don't know what happened to this organization. It was a very conservative group. In his last 2 years of life, from 1981 to 1983, Dr. McDonald also was the head of the John Birch Society. I don't know what happened to the Western Goals Foundation that he started. I really don't know. I tried to mail letters to this address listed here in the book, the Larry McDonald Memorial Foundation, but I never got a response. I don't know if these organizations still exist today. Now, let me read you a little bit here about Dr. McDonald. It says here, Dr. Lawrence Patton McDonald was a fearless defender of liberty and a strict constitutionalist who served with distinction in the United States Congress. He was a staunch patriot, a loving husband and father, and a Christian statesman. A conservative Democrat, he represented the 7th District of Georgia in the United States House of Representatives from 1975 until he was murdered, along with the 268 other passengers, including 61 Americans, on Korean Airlines Flight 007. It was downed by Soviet air-to-air missiles over the Sea of Japan on September 1st, 1983. Congressman McDonald endured numerous attacks from his own party leadership and others in Congress and from the mass news media for his defense of liberty against unconstitutional laws, executive actions, and liberal judicial activist decisions, as well as for his uncompromising opposition to communism. Perhaps the world's foremost anti-communist, he was the leader of the growing movement to stop United States financing of communism and to unite worldwide opposition against that atheistic and totalitarian ideology. Larry McDonald's hard-hitting book, We Hold These Truths, is as valid and true today as it was when he authored it on the bicentennial of our independence. Indeed, the soundness and urgency of his message is far more apparent and more irrefutable today than it was then. We Hold These Truths is a fitting memorial to a great statesman. More than that, it is an important guide to our constitutional government, justice, and liberty. And there is a very interesting dedication in this book. It says here, to the coming generation of Americans, with the prayer that they will restore the constitutional principles we have abandoned, protect the freedoms we have neglected, and preserve the republic we have almost lost. He wrote that in 1976. This book is pretty much prophetic, was prophetic, and you've seen now, this is 2017, and hopefully this video will be still online on YouTube until the Lord comes back, you know. A lot of the bad stuff that he foresaw in there has come true, unfortunately. There is in the book a foreword by his wife. There is in this book an introduction by fellow constitutionalist Dan Smoot. And let me talk a little bit about of the contents of this book. It has the full text of the Declaration of Independence and the full text of the Constitution, including documentation on what was amended to the Constitution, when it was amended, and why it was amended. So you can pretty much track what was really written back in 1787 and what was added later on. Very good documentation on there, excellent work. And there are parts in the Constitution that are no longer in effect. Those parts are printed in italics. At the end of the book, there are two memorials. The one is by Mark Leuthold, that was the pastor of the Northside Independent Methodist Church. According to my research, this church no longer exists and the building is now used by a Baptist church. I've tried to do some research about the place where Dr. McDonald went to go to church, but this church no longer is in existence there. The building is used by another Christian group. The pastor, so you have his, although there has never been a funeral, because you know we assume that the passengers are dead because of a fatal airplane crash, but we cannot really know for sure what the Russians or what the Soviets back then really did with the leftovers of the plane. They're hiding something. And there's a lot of lack of clarity when it comes to the, so I even hate to call this a funeral sermon. I mean, of course, I can imagine the family wanted closure back then. We don't know what is being hidden by the Soviets. The whole details of why the plane veered off its course, or why the pilots did not notice that. Experienced pilots not noticing that they were flying off course and entering Soviet airspace, and that they did not communicate with the Soviet plane. I mean, just on and on and on. So many inconsistencies. A plane, a Boeing 747, even when it's hit by a missile, it doesn't just explode and end up in little shrapnels. We have seen pictures of other fatal crashes involving a Boeing 747, and usually it's huge chunks of the plane's body that remain intact. And why should I believe that in this case, all of a sudden, everything was just everything just pulverized? It was not the case. The plane made a slow approach to the ground, to the ocean, probably, most likely, to ditch in the water. So I assume that huge portions of this plane should be intact, and that I believe some people in Russia simply need to give me the truth. In fact, let me insert this fact here real quick. Jesse Helms, Senator Jesse Helms, North Carolina, who also flew to Seoul, South Korea, on a similar on another Korean Airlines plane that kind of flew parallel to KAL 007. Jesse Helms wrote a letter to Russian President Boris Yeltsin in 1991, and in this letter he addressed all the questions of possible survivors, the whole idea that, where are potential survivors? Where are they today? He asked. He asked them, are they still in some gulag, in some prison? Where are the leftovers of the plane? Where are any fragments of the plane? Why are they not being turned over? In 1991, he wrote this letter, and I do not know what kind of a response Jesse Helms got from Boris Yeltsin. If you click into the description of this video, I will give you two links. That one link will be to Senator Jesse Helms' letter to Boris Yeltsin, and the other link will be to my letter that I've written to Russian President Vladimir Putin. And I've sent this letter to him, but I've also sent this letter to I don't know how many Russian embassies and Russian government think tanks. I don't know how many of them. I don't know. Too many. I've written this letter. And I've taken Jesse Helms' letter from 1991 and edited it a bit to make it sound like 2017. I've edited a little bit, and now I'm sending this off to Russian sources, embassies, Russian president, and well, so far I have not received any mail from Russia, and that's really a shame. A shame. I really want to say shame on Russia for not answering and not giving out the truth about KAL 007, or at least giving a polite answer of what happened. I want to know what was the answer that Senator Jesse Helms got to all these questions. Well, I'm not going to get into this further here because we don't have that much time. Go to the description and click on the links, read those letters, and if you want to, just copy the text and put in your address and you mail it off yourself, and maybe you get a response. If I don't get one, maybe you get one. Main thing is get involved. And let me go back to this book here. It contains Mark Lutholt's let's say funeral sermon or at least a sermon commemorating, memorializing Dr. McDonald, and it also contains an essay by Joseph C. Moorcraft entitled "A Prophet Crying in the Wilderness: The Meaning of the Life and Death of Dr. Larry McDonald." Okay, after all this introduction now to this book, let's get to the next point. What are some of the most interesting points Larry McDonald makes in his book, We Hold These Truths? Now, he begins by giving a review of what distinguished Americans from Europeans and how the U.S. won its independence and then decided on a constitution and later the adding of the Bill of Rights. Of course, you get a little bit of historic background in the first few chapters. There's a total of 21 chapters in this book dealing with the founding period, the Constitution's writing and the original intent, and then some basic areas of the Constitution where later on you've seen a lot of violations and the idea of limited government being destroyed for the creation of some mega federal government, the principle of states' rights being attacked, the First Amendment being turned into things, the whole attack on Christianity that was perpetrated under the guise of the First Amendment, the removal of Christian expression from the public ever since the 1950s, 1960s. He goes into that. Now let me give you some things in here from this book. For example, Dr. McDonald explains very well why in the United States there is no popular vote, why there is an electoral college. Very good explanation here for that. I just want to read you that because there's a lot of things like that. Why is there no popular vote in the United States? Dr. McDonald, brilliant constitutionalist, gives you an explanation of that. It says here, for example, the chief official of the executive branch, the president, was not to be elected by a direct vote of the people, but was to be chosen by the state legislatures through an indirect method, which came to be called the electoral college system. Once every 4 years, each state legislature would appoint in any manner it pleased electors to serve in its electoral college, the number of electors equaling the number of senators and representatives the state had in the U.S. Congress. The sole function of the Electoral College, as prescribed in the original Constitution and modified by the 12th Amendment of 1804, was to cast 2 votes, one for a president, the other for a vice president of the United States. Such votes would be cast within the state on a specific day. The Electoral College would then automatically go out of existence. Electors would not even travel outside their own state. Their votes were transmitted to Congress, where they were counted together with the Electoral College votes from all other states. The person receiving a majority of all Electoral College votes for president was elected, and so also with regard to the vice president. Thus, the power of each state in choosing a president and a vice president was exactly equal to its power in choosing members of Congress. It is the most nearly perfect system ever devised for the equitable distribution of power among governmental units of differing sizes. The provision that each state must have at least one member in the House did give the smallest states a slight advantage. A state with a population large enough so that it had 4 members in the House would have twice as much representation, 2 senators plus 4 representatives, in the whole Congress as a small state with only 1 member in the House and 2 senators. But the big state might have a population 10 times larger than the small state, or even more. No large state delegate mentioned a one-man vote principle as a requirement for a representative government. Large states accepted the unavoidable disadvantage, but that still left major problems, and so on and so on. He goes on, pretty much explaining also the principle of states' rights here. But here is, why there is no popular vote, and there's more about that later on in the books, but I'm not going to tell you because I want you to read it for yourself. I'm just here to encourage you to read that for yourself. Limited government, another principle. Limited government through enumerated powers. What are enumerated powers? Go here. Find the answer here on page 23. The clause, Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes to, and so on and so forth, provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, was intended to denote the specific types of functions Congress may finance, to denote the specific types of functions Congress may finance with tax money, defending the nation and maintaining peace and harmony among the states. If the Constitution does not give the federal government power to perform a particular type of activity, the government cannot legally perform it, as the Bill of Rights makes clear. Here are the basic powers the Constitution gives to the executive or legislative branch of the federal government: to borrow money, to coin money, regulate its value, and punish counterfeiting, to handle all foreign affairs, including commercial relations and crimes committed on the high seas against Americans or their property, to handle all affairs with American Indian tribes, to defend the nation against foreign powers, to exercise concurrent jurisdiction with states in organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, to govern the militia when called into national service, to enforce national laws, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, to assist the states when called upon in suppressing domestic violence, to prevent the states from erecting barriers to the free flow of commerce and people across state lines, to guarantee that each state give full faith and credit to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state, to guarantee a republican form of government to all states, to admit new states to the Union, to guarantee a common national citizenship to all citizens of every state, to handle all matters involved in the admission of aliens to the country and the granting of citizenship to them, to fix the standard of weights and measures used throughout the nation, to establish uniform bankruptcy laws, to enact copyright laws, to establish post offices and post roads, to govern the territories of the Union not organized into states, including the District of Columbia, to administer all lands and other property owned by the United States, and to propose amendments to the Constitution. These are the enumerated powers in which Congress can act and not go beyond it. There's a chapter dealing with religion and the First Amendment. Let's quickly go here to this point here. For example, he really pulls down this idea of a so-called separation of church and state. The original intent of the founders was not to suppress religious expression in the public. There should be no separation of Christian faith and public expression or work in the public. The First Amendment wanted to abolish or prevent the creation of a federal state church, as this was the case back in Europe. But there is no separation of morals and politics. There is no separation of Christian faith and politics. There is no separation of Christian ethics and the economy. Nothing like that. Faith is involved in every part of public life in America. And the founding fathers of the Constitution, the founding fathers of this country, they all upheld this. There's a good point here on legislating morality. Dr. McDonald does a good job explaining this here. He says here, when men pass laws and ordinances under any type of civil government, they do nothing less than enact laws which are products of their own religious philosophies. Law, by its very nature, commands men to do or not to do certain things, so all laws contain ethical teachings or views. Contrary to the modern claim, you can't legislate morality, all laws are actually enacted morality. Every law is enacted morality. Good point. The only question remaining is this: whose morality? Whose morality? There can't be any neutrality in law because all laws are the result of someone's individually or collectively morality and religion philosophy. It is therefore impossible to separate church and state as claimed by secularists or neutralists when they use the First Amendment in an attempt to claim that it built a wall of separation between religion and government. There is no such wall. And he goes into a very great length to explain this to you. Get this book here on this. Then there's a lot of other things in here. Dr. McDonald claims that the 14th Amendment is illegal, that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but the 14th Amendment established federal control over state legislation, and that the Supreme Court is using this control over the states to empower itself. McDonald makes the point that later amendments, especially of the 20th century, damaged the original Constitution by working against the intentions of the founders. He claims, for example, that the 16th Amendment, quote, was arguably never properly ratified. The 16th Amendment is the income tax. Very interesting on this here, very interesting on this. The bloated power of the president, his point is that the president today is doing a work that really is not what the Constitution really intended. You can read this in Chapter 9, The Power of the Presidency. Let me just give you a short quote here. It says here, the basic tactic Roosevelt, talking about FDR, seized upon to build the kind of federal establishment he wanted was the use of public money to buy political support. The practice has grown under succeeding presidents, and the public attitude toward it has altered. During the Roosevelt administration, members of Congress were many times promised new or enlarged federal spending that was extremely important to them, but only if they supported something the president wanted, or it could work in reverse as a threat that spending would be stopped. And sometimes federal spending was cut to punish a member of Congress for not supporting Roosevelt. The same tactic was used on mayors, governors, and businessmen throughout the nation. I think we've seen this kind of work done under the Obama administration when this healthcare law, Obamacare, was when they tried to pass this. A law that is such a huge volume of pages. I guess most senators, most representatives never even read that law and do not even know the full scope of that law. They voted for something, not because they wanted the law, but because the Obama administration bribed everybody into voting for it. You know, if you don't vote for this law, then we're going to cut those federal grants. We're going to cut those. We're going to cut your access to federal money, or we're going to close this big Air Force base here, and you're going to have an unemployment problem in your state. There was so much of that going on with the Obamacare deal. Because of these dependencies the states now have on federal aid, federal money, free money, and Dr. McDonald gets into this in this book here, that this was never intended, you know, for states to apply for federal money, get this free money in, but with the free money from the federal government always came federal regulation and federal control, and this control muddles and really undermines the way the United States was set up. It was sovereignty for the states. It was states' rights. It was states dealing with things on their own, as it is, you know, read the 10th Amendment, you know, whatever the federal government is not supposed to mess with, that goes back to the states and to the people to deal with it on a local level. Not so any idea of expanding the federal government and creating new bureaucracies to deal with more and more and more and more of the people's lives and the people's problems. This is not the way the United States was. That's not what the founders intended. That's not America anymore. And Dr. McDonald really does a good job explaining this. Very critical. Dr. McDonald is very critical also of the role of the Federal Reserve. Pretty much the creation of the Federal Reserve would be unconstitutional to him because the power of regulating our money was supposed to remain with the Congress itself. He deals with the 17th Amendment on page 2. The 17th Amendment changed something. It says here, the 17th Amendment, providing for direct popular election of U.S. senators, took away from state governments their constitutional role of indirect participation in the federal legislative process. Very interesting there. So up until the 1915 or so, I don't know, remember what year it was, you could only vote for your representatives. There was no direct vote of senators, and the founding fathers did this for a good reason. They wanted state governments to be involved in what's going on in Washington. There should be state control over what was going on in Washington. And by doing away with that, by changing that, of course, you know, this is very seductive. The state promises the people, hey, you can vote directly now. You have more direct control over now. No. But that's not what happened. By doing away with the states as a as an instance that would have power over what's going on in Washington, what really happened is you prepared the way for a bloated, oversized, big federal government that just hands down regulation to the states. Do this, do this, do this, do this. And the citizens, the individual people, become more dependent on the federal government. I think Americans a long time ago, before all that happened, before that amendment was taken in effect, they viewed themselves first and foremost as citizens of a certain state. I'm from Georgia, I'm from Kentucky, I'm from Illinois, I'm from North Dakota. They saw themselves as state citizens, and they believed in states' rights, and that the states maintained a lot of sovereignty and kept some control over what was going on in Washington. And by the direct vote of senators, the states no longer had as much control directly over what was going on in Washington. And the people now see themselves more as dependents from the federal government, as little subjects of the big federal government, because everybody wants to get free money and a check from the federal government. And this is not how the founders set up this nation. Once again, Dr. McDonald does a great job explaining this. Then he gets into it with the Supreme Court and some of the ridiculous decisions. The whole chapter dedicated on the law of the land. You know, have you ever heard people say, oh, the Supreme Court decided, now this is settled law? Let me go to this one point here. Basically, yes, page 25. Dr. McDonald really makes the point that the Supreme Court in the Constitution does not have the role that it has today. Pretty much, Congress has the authority to limit the authority of the Supreme Court. So when your Supreme Court gets out of hand, for example, with judicial tyranny, Congress can pretty much shut the Supreme Court up and shut it down. Go to page 25 here. It says here, the judicial power of the United States is vested in the Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as Congress may create, and the judicial power extends to certain enumerated types of cases. The Supreme Court has original jurisdiction, that is, can try matters without going through lower courts in only two types of cases. Number one, cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls. And number two, those in which a state shall be party. In all other categories of cases within the judicial power, the Supreme Court has only appellate jurisdiction. That is, it can hear disputes only on appeal from lower courts. Moreover, its appellate jurisdiction, now listen, is subject to such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make. Thus, Congress can keep the Supreme Court from having any meaningful jurisdiction, and it can even abolish all lower federal courts. So now we're always hear about these federal courts and federal judges on the West Coast making some anti-Christian wacko decisions that are so out of touch with the Constitution. Congress can pretty much shut all of that down. And when the abuses of the Supreme Court go out of hand, Congress can direct that court to just go back to dealing with cases affecting ambassadors, public ministers, and consuls, and not to try to mess with the definition of when does life begin, or what is male, female, what is marriage, and who can be married. The Supreme Court has no jurisdiction over such things whatsoever. So there is no constitutional basis for Obergefell versus Hodges and Roe versus Wade and all of this. Those decisions have no basis for that. That is everything out of, all these decisions are based out of thin air and have no validity really. And there is nothing in the Constitution about such stuff. Now, let's go back here. The Congress can limit the authority of the Supreme Court, and I wanted to talk to you about this issue dealing with the law of the land. We go into that, and then I think pretty soon we'll close. Now let me get back here on this chapter on the law of the land. Let me wrap things up here a little bit. Dr. McDonald explains in detail the abuses of the Warren Court. That is, let me explain to you what it is. It says here, after 1896, courts kept ceding the federal government more power, but none of them, not even the New Deal Court, really capitalized on the awful powers of the new 14th Amendment as unveiled in Plessy. The New Deal Court ended in 1953 when Eisenhower paid off a political debt by appointing the former governor of California, Earl Warren, as Chief Justice. The Warren Court reign lasted until June 9, 1969, when Warren was succeeded in the Chief Justiceship by Warren Earl Burger. The Warren Court initiated, and the Burger Court continued, a new epoch in American history. Let me go on to try to explain this to you. The 1954 Brown decision means that the Supreme Court has the power to order any person or group of persons anywhere in the United States to do anything a majority of the court justices might, at the moment, think is the sociologically correct thing to be done. It has this power no matter what the Constitution says or the people, including the members of Congress and President, might want. The Supreme Court may reverse its own far-reaching decisions at any time because its decisions are not based on the Constitution, but on books and other influences operating upon the justices. That is the inevitable consequence of the Warren Court's revolutionary 1954 decision. This is dealing with a school desegregation issue. It says here, please understand, a Supreme Court decision is not the law of the land. Indeed, it is not a law at all. Only legislatures can make laws. A Supreme Court decision is a rule that is binding only on the parties involved in the case, and it is enforceable only on that limited group if the executive and legislative branches choose to enforce it. Then McDonald goes on in documenting how the Warren Court has given protection to radical leftists and communists, but the national conscience, as determined by the Warren Court, had decided that communists needed special protection because they were a generally disliked minority group. The Warren Court had made it virtually impossible, number one, for the government at any level in the United States to prosecute communists for subversive activities, number two, for government at any level to fire communists from public jobs, number three, for state governments to keep communist lawyers from becoming members of state bar associations or for bar associations themselves to exclude communists. Number four, for the State Department to refuse passports for communists to travel abroad for high-level communist meetings and then return to the U.S. Or number five, for the federal government to deport communist aliens from the United States. On the other hand, the Warren Court ruled that an anti-communist alien who had sought refuge in this country and whose political asylum here had already been upheld by two lower federal court decisions must be deported back to communist Yugoslavia. I mean, the Warren Court just sided with the secular, humanist, leftist ideology, and that's really bad. Destructive mobs demonstrating for black rights in southern states in the guise of peaceful civil disobedience, but under the leadership of professional agitators of hate and violence, were excused by the Supreme Court for violating state laws against criminal trespass, vandalism, and obscene behavior in public, overturning state convictions against civil rights demonstrators for committing such crimes in southern states. The Supreme Court has said the demonstrators were merely exercising their right to free speech, and that the more their free speech hurts, the more good it will do. On the other hand, gatherings of angry parents, students, and taxpayers protesting Supreme Court orders designed to shatter not only their school systems but their whole social order are not exercising their right to free speech. They must be swept aside at the point of army bayonets, if necessary, as at Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 and again in Oxford, Mississippi in 1962. Then it says here, the Burger Court, presumed to decide when life begins in a woman's womb and at what period in the process of gestation abortion may not be considered the taking of a human life. Since the mid-1970s, the Supreme Court, laboring under its extra-constitutional doctrine of a wall of separation between church and state, has banned the Ten Commandments from the public schools, prohibited even silent prayer in the public schools, left the door open for public school bureaucrats to discriminate against religious students by forbidding religious students to meet together as clubs on campus, forbidding public school students to pass out religious materials before or after school, and secularizing public school Christmas programs. It has also prevented the teaching of creation science theory while mandating the exclusive teaching of the secularist dogma of evolutionism in the public schools. The Supreme Court ruling in mid-1989 that the First Amendment allowed free expression, a term which is not in the Constitution, through burning of the United States flag as protest, was another example of the continued destruction of our Constitution, state sovereignty, and common sense. Dr. McDonald further goes on to explain why there should be no federal aid to education. Education really is a state matter, so the federal government should stay out of that. There should be no federal aid. He was pretty much opposed to federal aid, especially because it has aided communist regimes. There should be no revenue sharing, getting federal aid or free money, which led to federal control, regulation in state matters, and unconstitutional bureaucrats attaching strings to that free money. There's a final chapter that brings a little hope, and that is called Restoring the Constitution. And I'm going to get into that here, get to the end here. Now, how would we restore the Constitution? What advice would Dr. McDonald give us here? We find it here in the last chapter here. How would we do that? That is, electing the only federal officials that the Constitution ever intended for them to elect directly, members of the U.S. House of Representatives. By concentrating their time, money, thought, and physical energy in their own congressional districts, people could find, train, and elect real constitutionalists to send to the House. A House of Representatives controlled by constitutionalists and supported by the people could restore constitutional government, even if the Senate, the President, and the Supreme Court fought it all the way. Only the House of Representatives can initiate revenue bills. The House all by itself could not shoot the food stamp program, but the House all by itself could starve it to death. The solution to restoring the Constitution is as simple as that. It will require time, effort, and sacrifice to accomplish it, true, but not as much as it cost our founding fathers to win the blessings of liberty for us in the first place. This is what Dr. Larry McDonald wrote back in 1976. I tell you what, there ought to be a run on this book. I would welcome a fresh reprint of this book, and it should be given to every state senator and state representative and to every senator and every representative in Washington. And it should be given to every Democrat. You should never forget Dr. McDonald, who was a Democrat. He was not a conservative Republican or something like that. He did it all as a Democrat because that was the way to get elected back then in the South. He understood back in 1976 that party affiliation meant nothing. Because we're having to dealing with the rhinos today and all those people who want to work together in Washington. They do work together pretty much for, well, what can be called the New World Order. many times Republicans, they usually betray their own cause. You know how they play this game. Before the election, they play the pro-life Christian conservative, and then after the election, especially during a lame duck session, they betray every principle for which they got elected. And then all of a sudden they do the whole thing over again. It's before the election. We're playing to be they're all of a sudden they're pro-life, pro-gun, pro-family. And then later on, once they do get elected, then they have changed their mind, of course. So pretty much Dr. McDonald already knew in 1976 that all this party affiliation meant nothing. That should be handed to every Democrat here, this book. And I believe this book should also be given to people abroad. You know, a lot of foreign students or foreign people want to understand the American system of government. This book contains the entire text of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. It should be handed especially to foreign people who want to understand the American system of government. I mean, every person in North Korea, every person in China, and a lot of those countries that are very oppressive or in a radical Muslim country ought to get their hands on this and just get a breath, get the breath of freedom and see how a free system of government, how Republican government really works, so that we can keep the Republic and work for America to come back really as one nation under God, as a constitutional republic. This also should be a good reading assignment for public schools, so you suggest it for reading assignments in public school. I want to close, I want to leave you with the idea that you get a copy of this book and read it for yourself. Thank you very much.